while I was still at Newsweek, I'd gone down to the Vietnam Memorial, which is dedicated, and I'd ran into Hires, my radio man. Hadn't seen him since the war. And we started talking and kind of reconnected. So after I left Newsweek, I thought I'd go see Hires. So I went to see him and we hung out and we started talking about the war. And I became fascinated because, yes, we had terrible memories of it. And yes, it was awful, but it also for us was the one moment in our lives where we really mattered and we were part of something and everybody depended on each other. And suddenly you're back and you live these very individualistic, isolated lives. And so I wrote a story for Esquire called Why Men Love War. By the way, it's one of Esquire's top 10 best war stories ever written in their whole 75 years. And I'm very proud of it. But it got me thinking, and so I thought I'll go see if I can get into Vietnam and go find these people I fought against. It was very complex, and I had to do a lot of these negotiations with the consulate and back and forth. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. And then I got a call. It's the Vietnam consulate in New York. Would you like to go to Vietnam for a month? I said, yes. I said, okay, be in New York Monday. This was Friday. And I got to New York on Monday. They gave me my visa, put me on a flight, and I got to Thailand, and I waited there. I turned my passport over to the Vietnam embassy, and they came and said, we're going tomorrow. So I got on an Air Vietnam plane, which was like a bus in Mexico. And chickens, there were people, and nobody else. By the way, we had no diplomatic relations with Vietnam. There were like 3 or 4 other Americans in the whole country. And my passport was no good. They didn't take credit cards. I had to carry a bunch of $100 bills. I flew into Hanoi. They were going to meet me. And I landed at the Hanoi airport, which is ringed with bomb craters. And the plane lands, it's late afternoon. Everybody gets off. People pull up in motor scooters and little rickshaws and a couple of cars, and they drive away. There's nobody there to meet me. It's getting dark. And I'm thinking, oh my God, the last time I was here, there was one of 500,000 Americans, and now it's just me with my notebook. And what do I do? And the lights go off in the airport, and I'm just standing there. What do I? And then I see this lights coming down to the road, and they came pick me up. Sorry, the car broke down. We only have one car at the foreign ministry, and it was quite amazing. So that became the focus for this going back, and the idea I was working on was what lets us. We're raised to love one another and not kill, and to love thy neighbor. What lets us do that? What lets us turn other human beings into something less than human? Because really, you're afraid of dying when you go to war, but you're also afraid of killing someone else. And so what was that all about? So I spent a month in Vietnam, and I went to the battlefields in the north, all the way to the Chinese border, and sat in these mountain villages lit by lanterns, and the whole village was sitting in the circle of light. In the middle was me and some of the North Vietnamese veterans, and we would talk about the war, and because they'd been out in the mountains like I had, and they had it much worse, and we just realized that even then, it was just 10 years after the war was over, there was a whole new generation of people in Vietnam, and those North Vietnamese veterans felt a little marginalized, and particularly the Viet Cong in the South did. But we really found out we had more in common with each other than just about anybody else. And so that's why I call the book Brothers in Arms, because it wasn't just about my comrades, which you might expect, but it was about them as well, that we'd all been part of this experience. And if we could see each other as humans, then maybe we could find a way out of this cycle. It really helped me close the circle of part of that experience, although I realized later that so much more remained. And I think it's some very good things, but some traumatic things as well. And when I left Newsweek, I thought, well, why don't I write something about Vietnam like a play? So I wrote a play called Boot. And I told a friend of mine out in LA who'd worked for me at the California magazine, he said, come on out and maybe we can do a TV series. Because MASH was just going off the air. But I didn't want to do a combat series. So I thought back on when I fainted and broke my nose. The nurse who had given me some smelling salts and helped me, in taking care of me for a day, I couldn't imagine what she was doing there, because it looked like that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark where at the end they have the Ark of the Covenant and it goes in this huge warehouse. It goes as far as you can see. That hospital, as far as you could see, was just beds of wounded and disfigured 19 and 20-year-olds. And I couldn't imagine what she was doing there. And I thought, why don't we do a series about the women in war who were there to heal and to help and not to kill? So the original idea was to make it a half-hour comedy like MASH, but I ended up with this guy named John Sacred Young who had done a Rumor of War, which is a 2-part drama, and we said, let's do it as a drama. So we did, and that became China Beach, which ran for almost 60 episodes, from 87, I think, to 90, 91. It's so interesting, the nurses, we kind of wrote it for, and the first episode came out, and we got all these angry letters. We hate this. This is horrible. You've ruined us. And so I'd call people up and say, what don't you like? I said, well, you show us drinking, you show us having sex, and you show us swearing. And I said, well, but you did. And that makes you real, and that makes you human. The show begins with this woman coming down to the beach in a red bathing suit and a book and a towel, and just getting ready to be on a normal beach. And she has her sunglasses and starts to pick up her book, and you hear this whop, 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 whop. And she puts the sunglasses down, and she looks up, and she looks at her book. And then the helicopter gets closer and closer. She closes her book, folds up her towel, and leaves. And the next scene is she's in her scrubs going into this scene where they've just delivered a whole helicopter, 2 helicopters full of wounded, and they're yelling and trying to get them taken care of. And you think, wow. And she was ready to go home. And it was her last day. And it turns out she never goes home, and she never finds home. And the whole series kind of comes back to the last shot is the same actress in a Huey in a park, a kind of abandoned Huey that they made just a park thing years later. And she never left, right? So a lot of it is, and so we helped the Vietnam Women's Memorial we helped with, and these women came on. And here's the other interesting thing is, we made up all these stories in the first 6 to 8 episodes, and then we started getting, people say, how did you know I did that? How did you know what happened to me? So we then did an episode where we just put all those women on camera, really Richard Avedon, really close, just black and white, and we would have them tell the story, and then we would illustrate it with scenes we'd already shot of Vietnam. And it's pretty groundbreaking, really. And so we ended up with this huge archive of oral history, of women, of nurses, of donut dollies, of all kinds of women in Vietnam. And there was one woman who was an entrepreneur, kind of supposedly madam, and she had this convertible. We got all these letters saying, dude, there's no American convertibles in Vietnam. And then someone wrote in and said, man, how did you hear about my car? So it's really like where I told you that all the people had just 1 year's experience. So everybody thinks that was Vietnam. But there's 2 million Americans were there, and that's how many experiences there were. And the beautiful thing about that is, that was my film school. And I wrote, I created the show, and I wrote the first episodes and a number of others. And what we did as writers is we would challenge each other to write, I would write these long scenes with all this dialogue, and the really great actors would look at it and they say, I don't need to say this, I don't need to say this, I can act this. But it is called moving pictures, right? So we did these things where John and I would say, let's write a scene with the fewest words of dialogue. Who can do that? So we did. And then let's write a scene where the only dialogue is yes and no. Those are the only words you can use. Okay? Then you can only use yes or no, but yes has to mean no, and no has to mean yes. So it was real, because I didn't know a crab dolly from a crab salad. And it was really my film school. And it taught me the power of acting and the power of visuals and how to tell stories. And also when we talk, right, the words or dialogue, they can reveal, but they can also often conceal. The first day we started filming of China Beach, and I showed up at 5 a.m. and there's dozens and dozens of 18-wheelers idling, and there's lights, and there's this whole set that looks just like the China Beach Hospital. Quonset huts, and people walking around in uniforms and carrying what I thought, oh my God. This just feels so real. And it's that verisimilitude, that illusion of reality that I fell in love with film. And in fact, I'd always been having these dreams about Vietnam, nightmares sometimes. And after we'd been shooting China Beach for a couple of years, I would have trouble distinguishing between my dreams about real Vietnam and my dreams about China Beach episodes that I'd done. Because the power of the medium enters our consciousness in ways that words alone, like a novel, doesn't, or a magazine article. Because the magazine article enters our minds and we imagine the story, right? Or it moves us in ways that language reaches. But a film, it's like showing us the story. It's making it our experience too. And just the magic of that kind of took me over. And again, it grew out of being on that mountaintop in Vietnam, thinking my life was over. And in fact, that was the portal to that series, which led me on to a whole other career. So that's Vietnam.